She was the heart of her family, the savior of her patients, and the pride of her community. A doctor who healed with compassion and lived with purpose. But on a quiet summer night, Dr. Teresa Sievers returned to her home in Bonita Springs, Florida, and stepped unknowingly into the final chapter of her life. By morning, the echoes of her last moments painted a harrowing scene. Her body found bludgeoned, left in a way so violent it defied explanation. This wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. But the real shock wasn't just the brutality of the act. It was the unraveling of the truth behind it. Who would orchestrate such a calculated murder of a woman so beloved? What could drive someone to take her life with such cold precision? And most hauntingly, how close was the killer to her? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a plot so twisted it shook even those tasked with solving it. A murder-for-hire scheme that would expose dark secrets and shatter the very idea of trust. This is not just the story of a murder. It's the story of betrayal so profound that it turned love into a weapon. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth behind the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers, a story where every revelation cuts deeper than the last. To the world, Dr. Teresa Sievers was nothing short of remarkable. She wasn't just a doctor, she was a healer in every sense of the word. Known for her relentless dedication and innovative approach to holistic medicine, Teresa had built a thriving practice that attracted patients from far beyond the borders of Bonita Springs, Florida. Her work wasn't about prescribing quick fixes, it was about finding lasting solutions, treating not just the symptoms but the root causes of her patients' ailments. Her reputation as a holistic doctor was groundbreaking. While many in the medical community remained skeptical of blending traditional and alternative medicine, Teresa thrived on bridging the gap. She believed in the power of natural remedies, but she also valued the precision of science. Her patients adored her for it. They spoke of her kindness, her ability to explain complex medical issues in ways that made them feel empowered, and her willingness to go the extra mile when others had given up. Teresa was the doctor people sought out when hope seemed lost. But to those closest to her, Teresa was so much more than her career. She was a loving wife to Mark Sievers, a man she met in her 30s and fell deeply in love with. Mark, often described as supportive and affable, managed the administrative side of Teresa's practice, allowing her to focus on her calling. Together, they built a life that seemed ideal. A loving marriage, a shared vision for their family, and a sense of purpose that defined their partnership. Her daughters were her pride and joy. Teresa was the kind of mother who didn't just parent, she inspired. She wanted her girls to grow up feeling strong and confident, and she worked hard to instill values of empathy and determination. Friends recall how she would juggle her demanding schedule to make time for her family, whether it was cooking a family dinner, attending school events, or simply sitting with her daughters to hear about their day. Outside her home, Teresa was a beloved figure in the Bonita Springs community. She had a magnetic personality, vibrant, engaging, and genuinely kind. She was the person who volunteered at local charities, brought food to a friend in need, or simply offered words of encouragement to someone going through a tough time. Her energy was contagious, and her ability to make others feel seen and valued left a lasting impression on everyone she met. But Teresa's ambition was not without sacrifice. She worked tirelessly, often putting in long hours at her clinic. She traveled frequently to speak at conferences or to learn about the latest advancements in her field. Yet, no matter how busy she was, she always seemed to find a way to balance it all: her career, her marriage, her children, and her community. Her life, by all accounts, was the picture of success. But, as we all know, appearances can be deceiving, and Teresa and her family took a trip to Connecticut to celebrate her mother's birthday. It was a joyful occasion filled with laughter and love. Teresa loved her family deeply, and this time together was a welcome break from her demanding routine. Her daughters played with their cousins, her mother beamed with happiness, and Teresa herself seemed relaxed and happy. a rare moment of peace for someone who was always on the move. But all vacations must come to an end. On June 28, Teresa boarded a flight back to Florida alone, eager to return to her patients and prepare for the week ahead. Her family would follow shortly after, allowing her a little time to catch up on work. For Teresa, it was just another example of her dedication, a commitment to her practice, her patience, and the life she had built. No one could have predicted what would happen next. By the time the sun rose the following day, the Teresa Sievers the world had come to know, a healer, a mother, a wife, a friend, was gone. Her body was discovered in the kitchen of her home, beaten so brutally that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. The woman who had spent her life healing others had met a death so violent it defied comprehension. In the days and weeks that followed, her family, friends, and patients would be left to grapple with an unthinkable reality. How could someone who brought so much good into the world become the target of such unimaginable evil? The community mourned, struggling to understand how something so horrific could happen to someone so beloved. But as the investigation unfolded, what began as a tragedy would become something even darker. Beneath the surface of Teresa's perfect life lay secrets that no one could have anticipated. Secrets that would unravel a shocking truth and leave the nation asking, how well do we really know the people we trust the most? It began like any other humid summer morning in Bonita Springs, Florida. The streets were quiet, the soft hum of air conditioners buzzing against the stillness of dawn. But inside Dr. Teresa Sievers' home, something unimaginable had unfolded, a nightmare so gruesome it would haunt the community for years to come. By all accounts, Teresa's Sunday had been uneventful. She had returned home late from a family trip to Connecticut, eager to get back to her patients at her holistic medical practice. Her husband, Mark, and their 2 daughters had stayed behind to visit with relatives a little longer. Teresa was alone. The house was quiet. Nothing seemed amiss. But by Monday morning, the first sign of something unusual appeared. The house lights. A sharp-eyed neighbor noticed that they were still on, unusually bright for so early in the morning. It seemed out of character for Teresa, who was known to be meticulous in her habits. As the hours stretched on, unease began to grow. When Teresa didn't show up for her scheduled appointments at the clinic, alarm bells began to ring. Her staff tried calling, texting, but there was no answer. Concerned, one of her employees reached out to her husband, Mark Sievers, still in Connecticut. Mark initially sounded calm, even collected, but the worry in his voice was unmistakable. He called a family friend who lived nearby and asked them to check on Teresa. The family friend arrived at the Sievers' home, expecting to find Teresa busy with her morning routine or perhaps already on her way out. But the moment they stepped inside, the oppressive silence of the house was suffocating. Something wasn't right. They called out her name, once, twice, but there was no answer. Moving cautiously toward the kitchen, they saw it. Teresa's body lay crumpled on the cold, hard tiles, motionless. The first thing that struck them was the blood. It was everywhere, pooling around her head and staining the white tile floor a deep crimson. The sight was so horrific, so violent, that it didn't seem real. Her head bore the brunt of the attack, with wounds so severe they were almost indescribable. Investigators would later confirm she had been struck multiple times with a hammer, a weapon chosen not by accident, but with chilling intent. The sheer force of the blows left no question. Whoever had done this wanted her dead and had ensured there would be no chance of survival. The family friend, paralyzed with shock, scrambled to call 911. The operator's voice broke through the panic as they described what they had found. Paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing to be done. Teresa Sievers was already gone. By the time law enforcement arrived, the crime scene had already begun to speak for itself. Teresa was found lying face down, her body showing no signs of a defensive struggle. This wasn't an impulsive attack. Whoever had killed her either caught her completely off guard or had ensured she couldn't fight back. The brutality of the crime stunned even the most seasoned detectives. This wasn't the kind of crime Bonita Springs was accustomed to seeing. The quiet suburban community was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where violent crime was virtually unheard of. And yet, here was a scene straight out of the darkest corners of human nature. Word of Teresa's death spread quickly through the town. Her patients were devastated. The doctor who had healed so many, who had offered hope and compassion to those in need, was gone. How could someone so loved, so respected, meet such a violent end? How could this happen here, in a place where people felt so safe? As investigators began their work, the house itself offered its first clues. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows. Everything was in its place as if nothing had been disturbed apart from the kitchen where Teresa lay. That was the first red flag. Whoever had done this hadn't needed to break in. Then came the next revelation. The home's security system had been turned off. Not tampered with or overridden, but manually deactivated by someone who knew the access code. The chilling implication was impossible to ignore. Teresa's killer wasn't a stranger who stumbled into the house by chance. This was someone who knew her, someone she may have even trusted. Detectives immediately began canvassing the area, speaking to neighbors, colleagues, and anyone who might have had contact with Teresa in her final hours. The questions mounted with every interview. Who would have reason to harm her? Who had access to the home? But the most unsettling realization was yet to come. When police reviewed the initial report, they noticed something odd in Mark Sievers' reaction. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't hysterical. His calm demeanor stood out like a glaring anomaly in the chaos of the tragedy. Mark had immediately called for someone else to check on Teresa. But why hadn't he contacted her himself? Why hadn't he seemed more concerned about her silence? By the end of that first day, the pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but one thing was clear. This was no random act of violence. Teresa Sievers had been targeted, and the truth of who was behind it, and why, would soon send shockwaves through her family, her community, and the nation. In the aftermath of Dr. Teresa Sievers' shocking murder, a quiet town in southwest Florida found itself gripped by a terrifying question. Who would do this? And why? The brutality of the crime left the Bonita Springs community in disbelief. A woman so loved by her family and patients, a respected doctor and mother, had been viciously taken from the world in the safety of her own home. But as the investigation began, what was initially thought to be an open and shut case soon revealed an even darker truth. Leading the charge was Detective David Lebed of the Lee County Sheriff's Office, a seasoned investigator with years of experience under his belt. Detective Lebed had worked through some of the toughest cases, but the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers, its methodical execution, and brutal aftermath would be unlike anything he had ever seen. He was joined by Detective Michael Downs, a forensic expert with a sharp eye for detail. Together, they would face an unraveling web of secrets, lies, and betrayal that would test every bit of their investigative skills. From the start, the crime scene raised more questions than answers. Teresa's body was found in her kitchen, the area around her marked by a violent struggle. Her face and head were unrecognizable, the result of blunt force trauma from a hammer. But the most perplexing element was the absence of a clear motive. Detective Lebed and his team knew the initial signs of forced entry were critical. A side door to the Sievers home had been pried open, suggesting the possibility of a robbery or break-in gone wrong. But as they combed through the house, they realized that valuable items, cash, jewelry, firearms had been left untouched. There was no sign that a robbery had taken place. This pointed them in another direction entirely. What if the murder wasn't a random act of violence? What if someone knew Teresa? Someone who had a much darker reason to want her dead? The investigators soon turned to a key piece of evidence: the hammer. Found lying next to Teresa's body, its handle stained with her blood, it was clear that this was the weapon used in the attack. It was a violent, personal choice of weapon, and the brutality of the crime suggested that this wasn't an act of passion. It was cold, calculated, and meant to send a message. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to end Teresa's life. They were trying to erase her completely, to make sure she never had the chance to tell her story. With few physical clues, the detectives turned to the digital world for answers. The role of modern technology, cell phone data, surveillance footage, and digital communications would prove pivotal in piecing together the truth. Cell phone records were the first breakthrough. When investigators examined the numbers Teresa had been in contact with shortly before her death, they were drawn to a string of messages between her husband, Mark Sievers, and his childhood friend, Curtis Wainwright, Jr. These texts raised alarm bells. Mark had been in constant communication with Wright, particularly in the days leading up to Teresa's murder. And as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered an even more disturbing truth. Curtis Wright, along with his associate, Jimmy Ray Rogers, had been in the area of Bonita Springs at the time of the crime, despite both men living in Missouri. This discovery set off a chain of questions. Why were these two men, hundreds of miles away from their home, in Florida at the same time as Teresa's death? What was their connection to the Sievers family, and why had they been in contact with Mark Sievers? Detectives then turned their attention to surveillance footage, hoping it would provide the key to unlocking the mystery. A nearby Walmart video showed two men matching the description of Wright and Rogers. They were seen purchasing items that seemed innocuous enough: tools, clothing, and a lock-picking kit. But as investigators compared the items purchased in the video to those found at the Sievers home, the connection became undeniable. The overalls they had bought matched the ones found at the crime scene, as did the lock-picking tools. It was clear Wright and Rogers had been involved in Teresa's murder. At this point, the investigation had shifted. What started as a routine murder case was now unraveling into something much darker. The evidence was piling up against Mark Sievers, but it wasn't enough yet to arrest him. So, detectives turned their focus to the financial records. What motivated Mark to do something so horrific? The answer lay in insurance policies. Mark Sievers stood to gain a substantial payout from multiple life insurance policies taken out on Teresa. After digging into his financial history, investigators found that Mark was facing serious financial difficulties. His business was failing, his debts mounting, and a costly divorce seemed inevitable. Teresa, on the other hand, was thriving in her career as a holistic doctor, a successful and well-respected professional in her field. The thought of losing everything, his wife, his business, and his access to her income, was enough to make him desperate. The timeline began to make more sense. Mark was facing the reality of his financial collapse, and it seemed that he was willing to go to any lengths to secure his future. He had already confided in friends about the strain in his marriage, his fears about losing custody of his children, and his growing resentment toward Teresa. But nothing could have prepared anyone for the chilling next step he would take. Detectives now turned their attention to Curtis Wainwright. Wright had been friends with Mark since childhood, and it seemed that he had a vested interest in helping Mark out of his financial crisis. Investigators discovered that Wright had a history of involvement in shady activities, including prior convictions and ties to criminal associates. It didn't take long for Wright to crack under pressure. Faced with mounting evidence, he agreed to cooperate with authorities. In a chilling confession, Wright admitted to his role in orchestrating Teresa's murder. He revealed that Mark Sievers had asked him to help eliminate Teresa. The motive? Money. Mark was looking to cash in on her life insurance policies and believed that removing her would be his ticket to financial security. Wright explained that he had recruited Jimmy Ray Rogers, another longtime acquaintance, to help him carry out the gruesome plan. Rogers, a former friend of Wright's, had agreed to travel to Florida and kill Teresa in exchange for a share of the insurance money. Wright's confession was the turning point in the investigation. He provided investigators with details that only someone involved in the crime could know: how they had entered the house, how they had incapacitated Teresa, and how they had staged the crime scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. The confession was corroborated by the forensic evidence, the cell phone data, and the surveillance footage, all of which aligned perfectly with Wright's statements. With this new information, law enforcement moved to arrest Mark Sievers. Wright's testimony, paired with the damning evidence, was enough to charge Mark with first-degree murder. But this was just the beginning. The investigation had uncovered a conspiracy so cold-blooded that it would send shockwaves through the legal system. Curtis Wright, Jimmy Rogers, and Mark Sievers all faced justice for the brutal murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers. But the case didn't end there. The trial of Mark Sievers would captivate the nation as the details of his betrayal, greed, and manipulation came to light. This wasn't just the story of a wife's murder. It was the story of how a family's darkest secrets came to be exposed in the pursuit of justice. As investigators pieced together the puzzle, it became clear that Teresa Sievers had not only been the victim of a violent crime, she had been the victim of a betrayal so deep, so personal, that it would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. And as the final pieces of the investigation fell into place, the haunting question remained: how does someone you trust become the one who ends your life? Mark Sievers presented himself as a grieving husband, a man shattered by the loss of his wife, the mother of his 2 daughters, and the cornerstone of his family. At first, his sorrow seemed genuine, his pain palpable. But investigators soon realized that Mark's version of events didn't quite add up. As they began to dig deeper, a different picture of Mark Sievers began to emerge, one that didn't align with the image of a loving husband and father. While outwardly supportive of Teresa's successful career, Mark had privately resented the demands it placed on their marriage. Teresa was a busy woman, splitting her time between her family and her thriving medical practice. Mark, on the other hand, appeared increasingly frustrated by the dynamic. Their relationship was strained, and though they seemed like a power couple to the outside world, those who knew them described cracks in the facade. It wasn't just marital discord that raised suspicions. Financial records painted a grim picture of the Sievers household. Their medical practice was struggling under mounting debts. Mark's attempts to manage their finances had been unsuccessful, leaving the family in dire straits. And then there was the life insurance policy, a substantial payout that would be triggered by Teresa's death. Investigators soon uncovered a motive that, while chilling, was clear: greed. But how did this man, this father of 2, translate his desperation into murder? The answer lay in Mark's connection to Curtis Wayne Wright, a man who had been part of Mark's life since childhood. Wright, a Missouri native with a long history of legal trouble, had been one of Mark's closest friends for decades. Despite their different paths, Mark as a family man and business owner, Curtis as a man who often found himself on the wrong side of the law, the two remained close. It was a bond that, as investigators would learn, would cost Teresa her life. Phone records showed an unusual amount of communication between Mark and Curtis in the weeks leading up to Teresa's murder. Text messages, calls, and emails painted a damning picture. Mark had reached out to his old friend with a proposition, one that would end in bloodshed. Mark promised Curtis a share of the life insurance payout if he could help eliminate Teresa. Curtis didn't act alone. To carry out the plan, he enlisted the help of Jimmy Ray Rogers, a man he described as a trusted associate. Rogers, a known felon with a violent reputation, was no stranger to the kind of work Curtis needed. The 2 men agreed to travel to Florida, where they would ensure Teresa Sievers would never return to her family. The plan was cold, calculated, and meticulously executed. Curtis and Rogers flew into Florida days before Teresa's murder. They rented a car and drove to Bonita Springs, leaving a digital trail that would later become key evidence in the case. Security cameras captured them purchasing supplies, gloves, cleaning materials, and other items at local stores. They even visited the Sievers neighborhood, scoping out the house to ensure everything was in place for the night of the attack. On June 28, 2015, Teresa returned home from a family trip. She was traveling alone, as Mark had stayed behind with their daughters. What she didn't know was that Curtis and Rogers were already inside her home, waiting. They had used a code provided by Mark to enter the house, ensuring there would be no signs of forced entry. What happened next was nothing short of horrific. When Teresa walked through the door, she was ambushed. Investigators later revealed the weapon, a hammer, used with such brutality that even seasoned detectives were left shaken. Curtis and Rogers carried out the attack swiftly, leaving Teresa's body in the kitchen. They cleaned up as much as they could, then fled the scene, confident they had left no trace. But as meticulous as they thought they had been, they underestimated the technology and expertise of the investigators. Surveillance footage, cell phone towers, and digital records began to piece together the movements of Curtis Wright and Jimmy Rogers. Their rental car was traced. Purchases made in local stores matched items found at the crime scene. And then came the breakthrough. Curtis Wainwright was arrested, and, faced with mounting evidence, he cracked. Wright's confession was both detailed and chilling. He described Mark Sievers' role as the mastermind of the murder, recounting how Mark had planned every step of the attack, right down to the exact time Teresa would be alone. He confirmed that the motive was financial. Mark needed the life insurance money to pay off debts and secure his future. Curtis admitted he had agreed to the plan for a share of the payout, but his confession would prove invaluable in securing justice. Curtis also implicated Jimmy Rogers, who he described as the one who wielded the hammer during the attack. The brutality of the murder, Wright admitted, was shocking even to him. His testimony not only sealed his own fate, but provided the prosecution with the evidence they needed to pursue charges against Mark Sievers. The revelations rocked the community. Mark Sievers wasn't just a husband and father. He was a man who had betrayed the very people he was supposed to love and protect. He had orchestrated the murder of his wife with cold precision, enlisting his childhood best friend to carry out a plan rooted in greed and resentment. For those who knew the Sievers family, the betrayal was incomprehensible. How could a man plot the death of his own wife, the mother of his children? How could he turn to a lifelong friend and ask him to commit such an act? These questions haunted the case, leaving a lasting scar on everyone involved. Justice in the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers would not come quickly or easily. As the arrests turned into court proceedings, the trials of Curtis Wainwright, Jimmy Rogers, and Mark Sievers gripped the nation, each unfolding layer by layer in a courtroom where every revelation seemed more chilling than the last. The first to face the weight of justice was Curtis Wainwright, the man who had once been Mark Sievers' closest friend. Their bond had begun in childhood, a relationship so tight that Wright was often referred to as Mark's other brother. But in a devastating betrayal, Wright had become the key to unraveling the murder-for-hire plot. Knowing the evidence against him was overwhelming, Wright struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence of 25 years, he agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder and testify against both Jimmy Rogers and Mark Sievers. In court, Wright's testimony was hauntingly detailed. He recounted how Mark Sievers approached him with a chilling proposition: murder Teresa, to prevent what Mark claimed would be a financial catastrophe for their family. Mark told Wright that without Teresa's life insurance payout, he wouldn't survive the mounting financial pressures. Wright described how he had reluctantly agreed, persuaded by Mark's manipulation and the promise of payment. As he stood before the court, his voice steady but devoid of emotion, Wright laid bare the methodical planning behind the crime. From late-night phone calls to discussions of how best to carry out the murder, Wright painted a portrait of cold calculation. The courtroom was silent as Wright described the night of the murder. He recounted how he and Rogers entered the Sievers home, armed with a hammer, and waited for Teresa to return. Every word was a dagger for those who loved Teresa, as Wright detailed the final moments of her life. The plea deal was controversial. Many believed Wright deserved a harsher punishment for his role in the crime. But prosecutors made it clear Wright's testimony was essential to securing convictions against the others. With his deal finalized, Wright's journey through the justice system ended, but his chilling words would echo throughout the trials of his co-conspirators. Jimmy Rogers, a man with a history of crime and a penchant for violence, was next. Nicknamed the Hammer, a moniker that took on a horrifying new meaning, Rogers stood accused of being the one who delivered the fatal blows to Teresa Sievers. Prosecutors methodically presented their case, starting with forensic evidence. Shoe prints found at the crime scene matched Rogers' boots, and surveillance footage placed him near the Sievers' home on the night of the murder. Cell phone records further implicated him, showing a trail of communication between Rogers, Wright, and Mark Sievers in the days leading up to the crime. But the most damning evidence came once again from Curtis Wright. Taking the stand, Wright described Rogers as eager and disturbingly nonchalant about carrying out the murder. According to Wright, Rogers had shown no hesitation as he wielded the hammer, delivering the fatal blows that ended Teresa's life. Rogers' defense tried to cast doubt on Wright's testimony, arguing that he was a self-serving liar trying to save himself. But the forensic evidence, coupled with Rogers' own behavior in the aftermath of the crime, made it clear that he had played a central role. The trial was tense and emotional, with Teresa's family sitting in the courtroom, forced to relive the horror of her final moments. When the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of second-degree murder, the weight of justice began to settle. Jimmy Rogers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never harm another person again. But the final and most anticipated trial was that of Mark Sievers, the man accused of orchestrating his wife's murder. As the courtroom filled with spectators and media, Mark's cold, detached demeanor became a point of fascination. While the charges against him were horrifying, Mark sat motionless, often staring straight ahead as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. The prosecution presented their case with precision, starting with financial records that revealed Mark's motives. The Sievers family had been struggling with debt, and Teresa's life insurance policy, worth over $4 million, was a lifeline Mark couldn't resist. Curtis Wright's testimony again proved to be the most damning evidence. Wright described how Mark had planned every detail, from orchestrating the alibi to ensuring the murder appeared as a robbery gone wrong. Wright's words were supported by a mountain of evidence: phone records showing Mark's constant communication with Wright, inconsistencies in Mark's own statements to police, and his strangely emotionless behavior following Teresa's death. The defense attempted to paint Mark as a grieving husband who had been betrayed by his friend, but the evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom was transfixed as the prosecution methodically dismantled Mark's facade, revealing the calculating man behind the crime. When the jury returned their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and sorrow. Mark Sievers was sentenced to death, his fate sealing the final chapter in a case that had shocked the nation. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but the scars of Teresa's murder would never fully heal. Her two daughters, now left without both parents, were taken in by loving family members who vowed to protect them from the darkness of their past. For Teresa's friends, patients, and community, the trials were a painful but necessary step toward justice. Many spoke of her legacy as a healer and advocate, refusing to let her life be overshadowed by the tragedy of her death. As the courtroom emptied and the media moved on, one question lingered in the minds of those who followed the case. How could someone so trusted and loved orchestrate something so evil? In the end, the story of Teresa Sievers is not just a tale of loss, but a sobering reminder of the depths to which greed and betrayal can lead. Justice had been served, but the echoes of that fateful night would forever remain a haunting memory for all involved. Dr. Teresa Sievers wasn't just another name in the headlines. She was a force of nature, a woman who spent her life healing others, empowering her patients, and uplifting her community. Her approach to holistic medicine didn't just treat symptoms. it gave people hope for a better, healthier life. She wasn't just a doctor, she was a mother, a wife, a daughter, and a friend. Her loss created a void that will never truly be filled. But Teresa's death was more than a tragedy. It was a betrayal that cut to the core of everything we hold dear. Her life, so full of promise, was taken not by a faceless stranger, but by those she trusted most. The pain of her family, her friends, and her community was compounded by the shocking realization that someone so close to her could harbor such malice. It forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths. How could greed and power drive someone to such cold, calculated violence? What warning signs did those closest to Teresa miss or ignore? These questions linger, unanswered, leaving us with a profound sense of unease about how far people will go when blinded by self-interest. But perhaps what makes this case even more haunting is the enduring aftermath. Teresa's daughters were left without a mother. The community that once celebrated her work was left mourning a bright light extinguished far too soon. The courtroom battles, the confessions, and the verdicts, all of it felt like a bitter attempt to bring closure to a story that could never truly have a satisfying ending. Yet, in the face of such darkness, there are lessons to be learned. Teresa's story reminds us of the importance of vigilance, even with those we think we know best. It teaches us the power of justice, even when it feels like it can never fully right the wrongs of the past. Most of all, it challenges us to reflect on our own lives. How do we protect ourselves and our loved ones in a world where betrayal can hide behind a smile? As you think about Teresa's story, ask yourself, how far would someone go for greed and power? And how do we ever truly know the people we let into our lives? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they're questions we must ask if we hope to learn from the tragedy that unfolded. Teresa's legacy, however, isn't just defined by her death. It's defined by the countless lives she touched, the patients she healed, the children she loved, the friends she supported. Her spirit lives on in the memories of those who knew her, in the stories we share, and in the lessons we carry forward. Her work was about healing, and perhaps even in the shadow of her loss, her story can inspire us to heal, to be vigilant, to cherish those we hold dear, and to fight for justice when it's most needed. What are your thoughts on this case? What lessons do you take away from the tragic loss of Dr. Teresa Sievers? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as thought-provoking and chilling as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another true crime story that uncovers the truth. Together, let's ensure that the voices of victims like Teresa Sievers are never forgotten, and that their stories continue to remind us of the strength it takes to seek justice in the face of unimaginable loss.